The most common reason NLP techniques fail isn't because only elite brainiacs can make it work. It's because even the top teachers in the world are teaching it wrong. Meaning, no matter how much money you've spent on NLP trainings and no matter how many certifications you have, you're destined to fail. So in this video, I'm going to reveal 3 NLP techniques you were likely taught wrong no matter who your NLP teacher is. Let's get right into this. Being conscious of how you represent information internally is a core foundation of Neuro Linguistic programming. This coding is the key to changing how you think and feel about yourself and the world around you. It can reveal why you have the problems you have, and it can reveal how to solve those problems. It can also show you how to clear the pathway to the successes that you want to achieve. So doesn't it seem like it would be really important to get this right? Yes. Absolutely. If you get this wrong, you're not going to be able to make NLP work. And the crazy thing is that every NLP training I attended, even with some of the top trainers in the world, taught this wrong. So how are you going to get this right? Before I show you that, you have to understand the trap that nearly everyone who practices NLP falls into. Story time. One day, my mentor, Steve Andreas, and I were emailing back and forth, and I happened to mention that I'm very kinesthetic. If you've taken any NLP trainings or read any NLP books, you know that people tend to favor a representational system like auditory, visual, or kinesthetic. This means that even though theoretically all 5 senses may be represented in how you internally represent your map of the world, we tend to lean on one representational system more than the other. For example, visual people process information visually. They tend to speak quickly because they're trying to keep up with the visual thoughts represented in their minds that tend to play like movies. They also tend to look up while doing this, and their eyes are usually wide open and reflect a lot of light. Auditory people tend to hear voices and sounds to process their thoughts. They often pull their shoulders back a bit as if clearing the space to hear better, and often tilt their head to the side, putting their best ear forward. Their own voices are often resonant and melodic. Kinesthetic people can be overweight, but not always. The overweight types tend to be drawn toward comforts like comfortable clothing and are more likely to indulge in eating comfort foods that are not good for them. They usually hunch a bit and speak slowly because they really feel what they think and they feel what they say. There's also the kinesthetic athlete, though, who enjoys physical pleasures through body movement and peak physical performance. These types tend to be very active and process thoughts and feelings through physical movement like dance and sports. Unfortunately, when people take NLP trainings, they immediately try to define themselves as a visual, auditory, or kinesthetic, and they try to quickly judge others by what they think their preferred representational systems are as well. Like stereotypes, you will on occasion run into people who fit exactly the visual, the auditory, or the kinesthetic types. But the reality is, most of us are quite balanced between all 3, making it mostly useless to try to peg someone as being only one. We also tend to shift our preferred modalities from context to context. For example, when you're playing a sport, you might heavily reference the visual modality, but when you're with your family, you may switch to more kinesthetic, favoring more touch. And then when you pick up the guitar to practice playing it, you switch to auditory. Now back to my conversation with my mentor. Steve asked me, what did I mean when I called myself kinesthetic? So I said, well, I always have to feel something before I make a decision. Like I always have to feel whether or not something is right before I make a choice. Even though we were corresponding by email, I could almost hear the laughter. Damon, he wrote. In that sense, we're all kinesthetic. What do you mean? I replied. We can't all be kinesthetic. Some people are more visual and some are more auditory, right? Yes, he replied. When it comes to information, we will have a preference for which modality we lean on, but that's so we can make an evaluation from the information we're seeing and hearing. And if you're truly kinesthetic, it will come from touch or proprioception. What I was referring to when I said that I needed to feel that something was right or wrong before making a choice is called kinesthetic evaluative and kinesthetic emotional, which accounts for about everyone in the entire world. Everyone makes choices and decisions based on evaluative and emotional feelings. If we didn't, we would never be able to make a choice about anything. The way it works is information comes in through the five senses. We process that information and represent it internally. The representation will likely only be in one or two modalities like visual and auditory, but some people will include kinesthetic like touch and proprioception. We call this kinesthetic perceptual. Not everyone favors kinesthetic perceptual. In fact, it's quite rare. My mentor had a hunch that I was not kinesthetic perceptual, and he was right. He knew that I was referring to kinesthetic evaluative. When I work with people who have attended NLP trainings, this is one of the biggest mistakes I see them making. Everything in your life, all meaning, purpose, and all value you perceive in the world comes from your evaluations of information that is represented internally by your five senses. If you don't know the difference, and most people don't, between perceptual kinesthetic and evaluative kinesthetic, you'll never truly be able to use NLP to the fullest extent of not only its potential, but your potential as well. And if you're a coach and you miss this distinction, you will struggle much more than necessary to help your clients. Moving on. Gregory Bateson was a professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz at the time when NLP was being developed there. He heavily influenced the founders and developers of NLP, with his most important contribution being a theory about how we make sense and meaning of the world around us. In a sense, it's how you structure your reality itself. Without Bateson's influence, NLP as we know it probably wouldn't exist. His theory can be found in all true NLP models except for one model in particular. And that particular model happens to be one of the most famous NLP models. And to make things worse, well, let's just put it this way. It's one big confusing mess, which I will untangle for you. Getting this right will set you apart from 90% of NLP practitioners out there. It's going to get a bit sticky, but it's absolutely worth understanding what I'm about to explain. So stay with me. The theory Bateson created is called logical levels, not to be confused with neurological levels, a model created by Robert Dilts. And this is where the confusion begins. Because of the influence Robert Dilts has had as a NLP teacher and trainer spanning more than 4 decades, and because he was one of the original developers, most people think that not only is neurological levels a true logical levels NLP model, even worse, most NLPers think neurological levels is logical levels. They think they are the same thing and even credit Robert Dilts with creating the theory of logical levels.
This model, the logical levels created by Robert Dilts.
Neurological levels does not even align with the theory of logical levels, therefore making it not even a true NLP model, according to many NLP experts like one of the founders of NLP, John Grinder. So what does it even matter? Some of you who spent a lot of money learning NLP are probably wondering, is it really worth changing the way you understand this? Well, I thought the same thing when my mentor, Steve Andreas, pointed this out to me. At first, I didn't really see a problem with other people learning and using neurological levels until I started teaching the self-concept model, which is a true logical levels NLP model. It wasn't until I learned and mastered a true NLP model that uses logical levels that I realized just how powerful and transformative aligning with logical levels is when you do personal development work. Wondering why it matters that neurological levels is not a true logical levels model is like wondering why the laws of physics matter when you're planning a trip into outer space. While neurological levels may make you feel good and you may gain some clarity about a problem or a situation you're in when you use it, it's not going to transform you. It's quite limited, and I would even go as far to say that it can create problems rather than solve them, which is why I stopped using it and why I stopped teaching it. What I've seen is people who take NLP trainings and were taught neurological levels have an incredibly difficult time learning logical levels, more difficulty than the average person, which means they struggle to access the incredible benefits logical levels could give them because they can't free their mind from the limited neurological levels. I naively thought that all I needed to do was just tell my students, the ones who had NLP training already, what the difference is so that they know and then we could move on. But that is not what has been happening. I'm seeing firsthand how having practiced neurological levels, a model that doesn't align with the core NLP principles, has limited their perspective and is really getting in the way of understanding how true transformation at the identity level happens. Logical levels is a dynamic theory that reveals how you understand and make meaning of reality. Understanding this is not just a game changer, it's a life changer. If you're practicing neurological levels, I recommend that you stop and that you really start to understand what logical levels truly is. I also recommend that you understand how logical levels works in NLP models that are actually logical levels based. The difference will astound you. So far, the NLP concepts in this video all have one thing in common. I was taught all of them wrong by world-renowned NLP teachers, and I was corrected on all of them by the same person, my mentor, Steve Andreas. This next one is no exception. If you want to make this next classic NLP pattern work correctly, there's two things you need to get right that everyone gets wrong. Before this was pointed out to me, this process never worked, and I unfortunately put it on a shelf in the dark recesses of my mind until I was reading the book Transforming Yourself by Steve Andreas. And in it, he mentions that this pattern is actually a piece of identity work. I had never thought about it this way, and no one had ever taught it that way. As far as I knew, the primary purpose of this pattern was to overcome bad habits, but because I couldn't make it work, years passed and many opportunities to use this extraordinary process in my life and with my clients were missed. Let's say you smoke or you overeat, and it feels like you can't stop yourself. It feels like a compulsion. First, you need to understand what is creating the feeling of compulsion. For most people, it will be visual, as in you see the food or you see the cigarette. This can happen in real time, right in front of you, or it can simply happen in your mind. You think about food or a cigarette and suddenly you have to have it. As usual, in NLP, we're not interested in the content as much as we're interested in the structure and the process that compels you to do or not do something. In other words, the how instead of the why. How are you seeing that cigarette or that crispy fried chicken wing dripping with sauce? You're likely fully associated, meaning you're seeing it from a point of view perspective, like it's right in front of you. When you experience compulsion, just like when you experience a phobia, you're overly associated, which means you're locked into this point of view perspective and it feels like there's no escape. The only thing that exists is the cigarette or the chicken wing and nothing else. Like you're stuck in tunnel vision. You're stuck in a pattern. So what does it take to prevent this from happening? A pattern interrupt, known as the Swish pattern. The Swish pattern is a classic NLP pattern like no other. It's as simple as it is dynamic and powerful, but only if it's done correctly. Once you've found the image that causes you to feel compelled toward the thing you want, but you shouldn't have, you move on to creating a new image, an image of your ideal self, the ideal you who no longer smokes and who no longer eats things that are bad for you. The way the Swish pattern works is you set the compulsion image of what it's like when you feel like you can't stop yourself from doing the habit you don't want to do right in front of you. You put that image of your ideal self underneath it and make it small. Then you practice swishing the compulsion image down and making it small as you swish the ideal image of yourself up and make it bigger. You do this until it creates a new pattern. The next time you see that trigger that compels you to act out the bad habit, an image of your ideal self interrupts that pattern and leads you away from the destructive habit and toward becoming your ideal self, which means you'll fill in a different behavior that aligns with your ideal self, a behavior that is available to you wherever you are, rather than doing the behavior you don't want to do. The ideal image, which you're going to use to interrupt the compulsion image, is an image of your ideal self, the you who has solved all of your problems, including overcoming bad habits like overeating and smoking. The you who is living your ideal life. Now, here's the part no one gets right. In the image of your ideal self, it's extremely important that you see your ideal self in no particular context and not doing any particular behavior. See yourself from head to shoulders, or maybe from the waist up. Do not see yourself doing anything in particular, no behavior, and make sure that behind your ideal self is nothing but a blank screen. What you need to see is your ideal self and only your ideal self. It needs to be an image that when you see it, you just know that it represents the you who is living your highest ideals and who has solved all of your problems. This will take some work for most people. Most of you will want to see you doing something that shows you're living your ideal self, like maybe driving a fancy car. And most of you will want to see yourself in some particular place where you're doing something wonderful, like living in a mansion. But don't do that. The reason why the Swish pattern works so well is because it is a shift in your identity. Since your identity is this huge concept that you take everywhere you go, no matter what you're doing, this ideal self-image needs to not be limited by any particular behavior nor by any particular location. For example, let's say you're wanting to overcome the compulsion to overeat. You've identified the compulsion image that makes you feel like you can't stop yourself from eating. When you go to create the ideal image of yourself that will interrupt the pattern that compels you toward the destructive behavior, you choose an image where you are working out in a gym. This, unfortunately, is how this pattern is often taught in NLP trainings. Instead of a swish, they teach you to create a chain. So what's the problem? It probably seems quite reasonable that instead of overeating, you would rather go to a gym and work out, right? Ideally, you would like to see yourself doing something healthy in a place you wish you were more motivated to spend more time. But this actually is the problem. So what happens when you get the munchies at 1 in the morning when your gym is closed? Because you switched from the bad habit to an ideal self who is at the gym working out, but the gym is closed, which means you can't work out. The new pattern you created is now useless. You end up raiding the refrigerator anyway. Adding behavior and context to the ideal image limits you to being your ideal self only when you're doing that particular behavior and only in that particular location, which isn't really ideal, is it? In other words, the ideal self image cannot generalize to multiple contexts and to whatever behaviors are available during any given situation if you anchor it to a particular behavior and a particular context. If instead of swishing from overeating to working out in a gym, you swish to an ideal image of yourself in no particular context and not doing any particular behavior, you would have more possibilities and options to choose from at 1 in the morning when you get the munchies. You would adapt to the situation and find a different behavior that aligns with your ideal self rather than eating. It's not surprising to me that people have trouble making NLP work for them. It's not because NLP is difficult or complex. It's that most of the people teaching it don't really understand it, so they don't teach it very well. If you're learning NLP incorrectly, you're going to have a lot of trouble trying to apply it to real life, and you'll be left wondering if you're actually getting any real results that are worth the money you're spending. Getting real life results is the true test of whether or not what you're learning is actually working. If you want to understand how to apply NLP to your life and get real results you can measure, you will definitely want to watch this next video on how to transform your life in 90 days.